Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 1, Halacha 3, and we're going to try to finish up this shiur. Today we're going to cover a little bit about the borders of Eretz Yisrael and then getting into mixtures. So the Mishnah said that the produce purchased from Getziv and beyond is exempt from the Demai obligation, and now we're going to talk about why Getziv in particular, what's special about Getziv. And the Gemara asks a question. It says, what is the law regarding Getziv itself? In other words, they're asking, was Getziv basically going to be part of the Ole Bavel or not? And is it going to be a border that they're talking about that, when you're talking about Getziv, that's outside? Or are you saying that, no, Getziv is like half in Eretz Yisrael and half out Eretz Yisrael, and when you go past Getziv, you're out of Eretz Yisrael. And, as we know, the areas within Eretz Yisrael, if they were consecrated by the Ole Bavel, that's Ezra and the group who returned, then it is going to be an area that has produce that's subject to Demai. And if it is going to be outside of Eretz Yisrael and not consecrated, then it's not subject to tithes anyway. Gemara responds in the Brisa and says, the produce purchased in Getziv itself is exempt from the Demai obligation. In other words, that this northern area, this northern town in Eretz Yisrael, Getziv, they're basically saying that that this town was left unconquered by the Ole Bavel, and then basically it's not going to be consecrated. So basically what this is saying is the land before Getziv is going to be in Eretz Yisrael. When you get to Getziv, that's Hutz La'aretz. That's outside of Eretz Yisrael. Also, by the way, going to make a difference if you are a Cohen. So the Brisa now is going to present a case in which Demai tithes must be separated even beyond Getziv, and that is going to be a chiddush and a surprise. This is going to be a Brisa from a Tosefta in 1.8, and the Gemara says, if someone purchases produce from a caravan of donkey drivers in Tyre, or from a storehouse in Sidon. These, by the way, are towns and cities that still exist. They're along the Lebanon coast in modern-day Lebanon. And the Gemara continues and says, it is subject to Demai from a storehouse in Sidon. And why is that? That's very mysterious. Why is that? And the Gemara says it is subject to Demai. So why? Because it's assumed that the produce itself was grown in Eretz Yisrael and exported to these close by towns called Sidon and Tyre. So they probably, those are very hilly mountainous areas. They were probably not growing a lot of grain product there. And if you are getting grain product over there from a storehouse in Sidon, you can assume that it's coming from Eretz Yisrael, and then you would have to tithe Demai. So the Gemara says, but if it's purchased from a storehouse in Tyre, or from a caravan of donkey drivers in Sidon, it is exempt from Demai. Why? Because in this situation, it's assumed that this came from outside of Eretz Yisrael. So the produce of caravans entering Tyre is basically going to signify it's coming from Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it's going to be true. And the opposite case is going to be where if caravans are entering Sidon, it probably means that they originated outside of Eretz Yisrael, and it's not going to be subject to Demai. So the Pnei Moshe explains the reasoning behind this, and he's saying that the storehouses are generally filled with local crops, and in the case of Tyre, which is distant from Eretz Yisrael, the local crops from those from outside of Eretz Yisrael are not subject to Demai, but Sidon, which is close to Eretz Yisrael, says the Pnei Moshe, is where the local crops are assumed to be from Eretz Yisrael and subject to Demai. The caravan, by contrast, says the Pnei Moshe, is going to be where they are generally formed for long journeys and carrying produce far away. And in the case of Tyre, this would be for produce of Eretz Yisrael, which would be distant from Tyre, but still close enough where a caravan could arrive from the city and still be profitable. And the case of Sidon, which is near Eretz Yisrael, is going to assume that if they're carrying from a caravan, that it's going to be from a longer distance, and it's going to be basically from Chutz La'aretz. That's the insight by the Pnei Moshe. So that's an interesting insight, because again, it's getting to the necessity to look at, well, where does your produce come from? Is this being grown in your land? Again, when we're talking about tithes, where it's talking about tithes, it talks about your produce and your land. It's talking about your grain, your wine, your oil from your land. So if this was grain that was grown in Eretz Yisrael, this is going to be subject to tithes, even if this is going to be exported. And without this Gemara, we might not have known that. We might not have known that. We might have said that, well, now you've taken it out, and maybe, you don't have to worry about separating Demai. Maybe Demai tithes are going to be treated leniently. Not so, says this Gemara. The Gemara is going to look into this a little bit more, as to say, regarding produce purchased from a caravan of donkey drivers that entered Tyre by the way of Getziv, this is going to be subject to Demai or not. And in other words, does the passage of produce through Getziv, where there is no tithes, exempted from the Demai obligations? So one of the things that came up in Masechah Shvius is going to be these border towns, and on the other side of the border town, they could be growing agriculture, and it will not be subject to Shvius sanctity. And on the other side of the town, and within the town itself, it can be subject to Shvius sanctity because it's within Eretz Yisrael. The question is going to be, what about if you're having caravans coming from Getziv itself? How are you going to treat it? Are you going to say that, well, maybe this was grown on the farms on the other side of Getziv? Or are you going to say that it was grown in the town, which we know and we just learned that it's going to be outside of Eretz Yisrael, or even beyond Getziv? So the Gemara says, come and let us see, that if the caravans had stopped in Getziv and sold its produce there, it would have been exempt from Demai, and now that it entered Tyre, it is subject to Demai? Of course not. And so the status has already been determined by the entry of Getziv, and it does not change. And so basically, this is saying that if the caravan entered into Getziv, it can be basically assumed that you grew this within the land before Getziv, which is going to be in Eretz Yisrael proper. And so when you're looking at a caravan coming from Getziv, they're going to be curious to see if it stopped in Getziv itself and sold produce there. And that's going to be part of the question, because you might have had a case where the caravan came from Getziv itself, and if it came from Getziv itself, it would be assumed that this is going to be grown in Chutz La'aretz, because we know Getziv is outside of Eretz Yisrael. If it's stopping in Getziv, then we can assume that it is from before Getziv and within Eretz Yisrael. Now we're going to get into the next part of the Mishnah, and we're going to get into mixtures. And the Gemara says that the challah of an Amma Aretz, which is going to be the Amma Aretz's truma mixture of food purchased from an Amma Aretz with money of Meiser Sheni, and then the remains of an Amma Aretz's mincha offerings are going to be exempt from Demai. And we're going to get into why these are exempt. And the first opinion is Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, when the sages enacted the decree on Demai, they did not enact the decree regarding these things. In other words, these items in particular are going to be exempt, not because they are assumed to have been tithed, but because the rabbis, for other reasons, did not want to include them in the decree. That's the insight by Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rabbi Yochanan does not explain why the rabbis excluded these items, and you have to go look at other sources to try to figure out why. The Chazan Ish says about this that the rabbis did not want to make it difficult to consume consecrated food, such as the flour of the mincha, and therefore excluded all such foods from the Demai decree. So you can find that in the Chazan Ish's book in 4.9. And you can also see a commentary by Rabbi Kanievsky in Derech Hamuna, Meiser 1388. There's a dissenting view. Rabbi Hoshaya says that the reverence of the holy is upon him. This is going to be the Am Haaretz, and therefore he does not give the Kohen something consecrated that has not yet been rectified through tithing. Basically, Rabbi Hoshaya, according to the Rosh Cirilio, is saying that the reason these items are exempt is that they are assumed to have been tithed because the Am Haaretz is going to be trusted with the consecrated food. Rabbi Hoshaya is basically saying that, yes, the Am Haaretz is going to be soft on some of the tithes, but they can be relied upon. They can be relied upon to tithe consecrated foods before giving them to a Kohen, and they have some reverence for these holy things, and so they are going to be more careful, particularly with Challah. So there's going to be a back and forth between these two views of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Hoshaya, and the Gemara says that the difference concerns Challah of the Am Haaretz. Regarding the view of Rabbi Hoshaya, the Mishnah, the exemption is stated only in the case of actual Challah of an Am Haaretz. What does that mean? That means that the Challah of the Am Haaretz is going to be separated, and the Am Haaretz himself separated it and gave it to a Kohen. It wasn't done through a Chaver who's going to be more careful in the laws of Taharos. So since the dough already gets consecrated when you make the Challah and the declaration, when it's still in the Am Haaretz's possession, we can assume that he tithed it because it has Kedusha. That's going to be the idea of Rabbi Hoshaya. And the Gemara continues, it says, but in the case of the Chaver who purchased dough from the Am Haaretz and then separates out the Challah, the Mishnah's exemption does not apply, since the dough, while in the Am Haaretz's possession, was not yet consecrated as Challah, and it is not going to be subject where it's going to be an object of reverence, and therefore we assume that it was not tithed. So we know that the Chaver is going to be very careful in taking out tithes, and also for protecting the dough from coming in contact with things that could cause it to become Demai. The Pnei Moshe is going to explain about this for Rabbi Hoshaya's point, that when the dough enters the Chaver's possession, it had not yet been consecrated, and that means that there's no reason for the Am Haaretz to have treated it with any reverence. And therefore the Chaver may not assume that it was tithed and has to separate the tithes, even if it is going to be from its Challah. That's going to be the idea. Now, that's not the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says in this Gemara that, by contrast, this is the same as that. In other words, whether it's going to be the Am Haaretz or the Chaver who separated the Challah, it's going to be exempt from Demai. And the exemption is going to depend upon the reliability of the Am Haaretz. It's not going to depend upon the reliability of the Am Haaretz. It's going to be basically with this general decree where there's a total exclusion of Challah from this rabbinic decree. So Rabbi Yochanan, according to the Vilna Goan, is saying that the decree of Demai was never stated regarding Challah and these other items that are consecrated in the Mishnah, and therefore it's going to be exempt regardless of whether it's been consecrated before entering the Kohen's possession or not. So the Chazan Ish in 4.9 says about this that, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he takes the tithes only from the unconsecrated part of the dough, and the portion is consecrated as Challah. However, although previously subject to Demai, it becomes exempt, according to Rabbi Yochanan. So basically, the tithes are going to be coming from the unconsecrated part, not from the Challah itself. And in the case of Rabbi Hoshaya, it's going to be possible where the Chaver could, or the Am Haaretz could even take out tithes from the Challah portion. In other words, the Chaver could take out the Demai tithes from the Challah portion. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying, no, if they're going to take out tithes, they're not going to be taken out from the Challah portion. They're going to be taken out from the unconsecrated portion. And again, there's an absolute exclusion of challah from this rabbinic decree, according to Rabbi Yochanan, and so once you've made it into challah, it's exempt from Demai. Now, the Gemara is going to give a difference between the view of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Hoshaya, and the Gemara says that the difference concerns the truma mixture, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Hoshaya, the Mishnah's exemption is stated only in the case of produce that belongs to the Am Haaretz, and when it becomes mixed up with truma. And since the food was already mixed with truma, while it is still in the Am Haaretz's possession, we may assume that he tithed it. Why? Because he assumes that he has reverence for the holy. So the Gemara continues, says, but in the case of the Chaver who purchases produce from an Am Haaretz and it becomes mixed with truma, the Mishnah and that exemption is not going to apply. Why? Because, says Rosh Cirilio, the food, while in the Am Haaretz's possession, was not mixed with truma. Therefore, it's not going to be an object of reverence. And we can assume that the Am Haaretz neglected to tithe it, and therefore it's going to be subject to Demai. Now, that is the opinion of Rabbi Hoshaya, not the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says in this Gemara that this one and that one is the same. And the Marafulda explains about that and says, to help explain Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, whether the produce became mixed with truma while in the Am Haaretz's possession, or the Chaver's, it is exempt from Demai, for the exemption depends not upon the reliability of the Am Haaretz, but upon a general and absolute exclusion of truma mixtures from the rabbinic decree. So again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, this decree of Demai was never stated regarding truma mixtures. And so even if this mixture comes into existence and it's in the Chaver's possession, it's still going to be exempt from Demai. That is basically the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. He's saying that this is a rabbinic decree. The Gemara is now going to look at another difference between the view of Rabbi Hoshaya and Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara says, what emerges between these two opinions? And the Gemara replies, and the Gemara says, the difference is where a seah arises and is removed from within a mixture consisting of 100 seahs of chulin and a single seah of truma. So we know that mixtures are going to be nullified in 1 in 100. And the Gemara is going to say, according to the view of Rabbi Yochanan, the entire mixture is subject to Demai tithes, since the seah of truma is nullified in the 100 seahs of chulin. In other words, it was never deemed to be a truma mixture. So it basically, you have 100 units of chulin, and you have 1 unit of truma falls into it, gets mixed up. Rabbi Yochanan is saying that this is subject to tithes, and that this is subject. Rabbi Yochanan is saying that this is subject to tithes for Demai because it gets nullified, and you're really just dealing with 101 units of chulin. The Gemara says that according to the view of Rabbi Hoshaya, the entire mixture is exempt from Demai tithes, since the seah that's removed is dealt with as truma, and the Am Haaretz is going to approach the entire mixture with reverence due to the holy, and assumed that he separated out all tithes. Rabbi Hoshaya, says the Pnei Moshe, is saying that the reason the truma mixture is exempt from Demai is that the truma content causes the Am Haaretz to regard it with reverence and to separate tithes. And the reasoning is going to be with regard to this 101 mixture on account of the single seah removed. And although he removes 1 seah and it's not actual truma, it's treated as truma and given to a kohen. And so that it doesn't, basically he's saying that it just never got nullified. And because it doesn't get nullified, he knows it's in there. And so he has reverence for it. He's going to take out the 1 unit of truma, even though you would say that, oh, well, perhaps it might get nullified, and he would take it out and he would go and he would rectify the pile and give it to the kohen. And then That's why this is not going to be subject to the Demai. They're both saying it's not subject to Demai separation, but the reason why is different. Rabbi Yochanan is saying because it is going to be just nullified, and you're just dealing with 101 units of hulin, and hulin anyway you have to separate out tithes. And then over here, basically according to Rabbi Yoshaya, you're saying that a truma mixture is going to be exempt from demai, and that's going to be because the truma inside of it's going to cause the am haaretz to have more respect for the 1 unit that got mixed in, and he's going to separate it out, and he's going to go find a kohen. That's what he's going to do. He's going to go rectify it. And although the one say he takes out is not actual truma, he still gives it to the kohen because he has reverence for these holy things, and he's going to be and basically that he's going to be careful to separate tithes from the entire mixture to make sure that the seah that's going to be taken out ultimately is going to be tithed. So basically he's saying he's going to rectify the entire pile just to take out the truma and then give it because he has so much reverence for these holy things. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about support for Rabbi Yochanan, and they taught in a Beraisa regarding the items listed in the Mishnah as exempt from Demai. And the Gemara says, and regarding all these items, if someone designates their Trumos Meiser or their Meiser Sheni of Demai, what he has done, he has done. In other words, the tithes, although not mandated, are still going to be consecrated. And the Gemara says, according to the view of Rabbi Yochanan, with this Bryce's ruling, it's understandable why. Because since items are not presumed to have been tithed by the am haaretz, any tithes someone designates are still going to be consecrated. Why? He made a declaration. He consecrated it out. So that's going to be the idea. The Gemara says, but according to the view of Rabbi Hoshaya, consider it like this. He says, these items are presumed to have been rectified according to Rabbi Hoshaya. Rabbi Hoshaya is saying that he's going to take the whole pile of the hulin that got mixed in. He's going to separate tithes from the 101 units to get out the 1 unit of truma and to give it to the kohen. So the Gemara is going to say that these items are presumed to be rectified according to Rabbi Hoshaya, and still you say this. And the question that is coming up, which is going to support the view of Rabbi Yochanan, that the average person, the view of Rabbi Yochanan is going to be that the average person is just going to leave it nullified, not going to go through the effort to figure out the calculation, to rectify it just because he has reverence. He's just going to leave it nullified. And the Gemara is basically saying that, he's not going to, he has to go through tithing and tithe the whole thing, not to get out the truma, the 1 unit of truma, according to Rabbi Yochanan. He's just gonna make it simple for himself, and he's just gonna say, okay, I have 101 units, and I'm gonna separate out tithes from that and be done with it. So the Gemara is going to resolve this conflict between Rabbi Hoshaya and Rabbi Yochanan, and the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Hoshaya, that the tithes are going to take effect because the one am haaretz who inevitably will not rectify these items, since it does not rest upon him with the reverence of the holy. So that's going to be hard to understand, and I'd like to take a look at what they're talking about with the Vilna Goan. Vilna Goan is going to explain it like this. Vilna Goan is going to say, in exempting the Mishnah's item from the Demai obligation, the rabbis rely on the majority of the Amoratzim who revere the holy and can be trusted to separate these tithes. That's the note of the Vilna Goan for this. And he's basically going to be saying, nevertheless, they recognize that there's a small minority of the Amoratzim who are going to neglect even these tithes, and therefore, if one does choose to tithe these foods, the tithes are going to be valid because of the possibility that this batch of produce was purchased from the minority of Amoratzim who do not separate these tithes at all. So the idea is that you have even though you have most of the Amoratzim separating out the tithes, there's going to be a minority who can't be relied upon at all and are not going to separate the tithes at all. And this Brisa seems to look at what's going on with the minority. Now, the Gemara is going to continue and it's going to say that it was taught in a Brisa regarding all of these items. If someone designates their Truma Meiser, if someone designates their Trumas Meiser of Demai or their Meiser Sheni of Demai, what he has done. Why? Because, says the Gemara, because of the one Amaretz who will not rectify these items. The Gemara seems to look like it's ruling in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan, because you have a minority of these Amaratim who will not do any of these tithes at all and leave it as tevel. So the it looks like it's refuting Rabbi Hoshaya's view, and that a lot of these people are not going to rectify these items at all, and they don't have any reverence for the holy at all, and so that it can't basically it can't be trusted upon to tithe this, and that's why they're saying if somebody separates out Trumas Meiser of Demai or Meiser Sheni of Demai from this pile, what they did. But they're worried about, in the case of Rabbi Hoshaya's point, that this part that that they may not like separate out any of it, just leave it alone, not have any reverence for the holy and separate out Trumas, and not make any separations. Rabbi Yochanan's point is to say, no, this is nullified, and to say that you have to treat the whole thing as Demai, and not assume that the Amaretz rectified this at all, because the minority, and it's probably a very large minority. There's a comment that when Kohen Gadol Yochanan instituted this, it was, yes, the majority of Am Yisrael was doing the tithes, but it was only just the majority. It was not a majority by like a very big margin. And so they're worried that if you're going to go by the formulation of Rabbi Hoshaya, that you're going to end up where most of the people, or significant enough people, are not going to bother taking out any of the tithes at all to rectify it. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan's point is going to be that, no, this is all just chulin, and it's still going to be subject to Demai tithe, and don't look at it like, oh, there's one part of truma in it, and then you have chulin in it, and let's go try to figure out how to rectify it and do it. He's basically saying that the minority of Amaratzim is large enough where they're not going to care, and so if you leave it so that there's no tithes at all, they're going to end up eating tevel. So the Mishnah continues, and it talks about the food purchased from the Amaretz with the money of Meiser Sheni, and that the money of Meiser Sheni, and that's going to be exempt from the Demai obligation. And we're going to get into that. The Gemara is going to talk and say, Rabbi Ban Barchia asks before Rabbi Zera, until now we know only that food purchased with Meiser Sheni money of Demai is not subject to the Demai obligation. He's basically asking a question saying, is this still going to be true if you purchased food with definite Meiser Sheni money? Is that still going to be the case? And Rabbi Zera is going to respond and say, even food purchased with definite Meiser Sheni money is going to be free of the obligation of Demai. So the Meiser Sheni money of Demai is money used, by the way, to redeem Meiser Sheni of Demai, and definite Meiser Sheni money is used to redeem definite Meiser Sheni produce. So if the person consecrated only, the uncertain sanctity of Demai, then when he goes and he redeems it, it's still going to have the sanctity level of Demai. That's going to be the idea when he deconsecrates it. So the Mishnah states further and says the remains of an Amma Aritz's mincha offerings are exempt from the tithing obligation of Demai. And the Gemara says they taught in a brisa regarding the items enumerated in our Mishnah as exempt from Demai. And the Gemara says regarding all of these items, if someone designates their Trumas Meiser of Demai or their Meiser Sheni of Demai, what he has done, he has done. And the tithes, although they're not mandated, they're valid. Why? Because he made a designation. And it's going to basically be a valid enough declaration that even though he doesn't have to do it, it's still a kosher declaration. So the idea, says the Vilna Goan, is that Rabbi Bar Chia is suggesting that the Mishnah's permit is perhaps limited to where the produce is definitely consecrated through the purchase of definite Meiser Sheni money. But if the consecration is going to be uncertain as to be whether it's going to be redeemed with Meiser Sheni money of Demai, and the sanctity of this Meiser Sheni money of Demai is in doubt as well, then the permit's not going to apply. However, if somebody consecrated it, they consecrated it. That designation, it's not required, but it's still going to be halachically valid. The Gemara is going to qualify this, and it's going to say, Rabbi Lazar says, except for tithes taken from the remains of the mincha offerings, and these are not going to be valid. And the idea here says the Rosh Cirilio, is that the remains of the mincha offerings are not the property of the Kohen, but rather they're going to be property of the divine, and therefore you can't designate them as tithes because you don't actually own them. And the Kohen's allowed to eat it, but Hashem owns it, and the Kohen does not have the power to give this tithe, so it's not a halachic statement. That's the idea. So the Gemara is going to talk about Rabbi Lazar's qualification. Rabbi Yirmiyah says with regards to the rest of the items listed in the Mishnah, so this will be like food that's purchased with Meiser Sheni money. The Gemara says that the validity of the Demai tithes are in dispute. And what's that going to be? That's going to be where you can find this, by the way, in Kiddushin Bavli 52b. Basically, according to one view, Meiser Sheni is going to be the property of the owner. That could be tithed. And if you separate out that tithe, it's going to be valid. According to the other view, the Meiser Sheni is the property of the divine. It can't be tithed. So that's Rabbi Meir's view. Rabbi Meir is saying that Meiser Sheni is property of the divine, and Hashem lets you use it. And therefore, you can't make out tithes to it. The rabbis are saying, no, it's for you to use, and it's also your property. And so, why is that in Kiddushin? Because the question is, can you acquire a wife with the Meiser Sheni money? If the Meiser Sheni money is the property of the divine, then you can't use it to acquire a wife. It's not your money. And in Kiddushin, it has to be yours. Your money, the money or what you're purchasing your wife with has to be in your possession, has to be yours. So just before that, we're talking about the mincha offering. And the mincha offering definitely is not the property of the Kohen. It's definitely the property of the divine. Over here, with regards to the Meiser Sheni and the Meiser Sheni, the status of Meiser Sheni in general, the question is that going to be your property or the property of the divine? And the rabbis are saying that it's going to be where it is your property. So the idea here from Rabbi Yirmiyah's comment is trying to show that if someone purchases food with Meiser Sheni money, it's going to be subject to a dispute. But in the case of the mincha offering, everybody agrees it's not valid. Everybody agrees that it's the property of the divine. There's no dispute. The question is going to come about with the Meiser Sheni of Demai. That's going to be the question. Rabbi Yosef asks, which dispute does Rabbi Yirmiyah refer to? And, basically, he's asking what Tanaic opinion are we dealing with that's going to validate a tithe separated from food purchased with Meiser Sheni money, but not separated from the remains of the mincha offering. And basically, no Tana says that. So the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Meir, who holds that Meiser Sheni is a property of the divine, the law of Meiser Sheni is identical to the law of the remains of the mincha. So Rabbi Meir is saying that not only can you not separate out mincha, the remains of the mincha, and just give it to the Goan, because everybody agrees it's the property of the divine. He's saying also the Meiser Sheni is also the property of the divine, and you can't separate that out and separate out tithes from food purchased with the Meiser Sheni money, because again, it's not yours. The Gemara is going to say, because he's going to say it's property of the divine. The Gemara is going to say, but the sages who say you can tithe, either one of them has accomplished nothing. That, by the way, is going to be saying where, in each case, the product, is not his own. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, who's going to hold that Meiser Sheni is going to be the property of the owner, the same is going to be true of the mincha offerings. And according to that opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to say whether a person tithes one or the other, what he's done, he's done. So the question is going to be, that neither Rabbi Meir nor Rabbi Yehuda distinguishes between Meiser Sheni and the remains of the mincha offering. So both basically are saying that, they're either the property of the divine or the property of the owner. And Rabbi Yirmiyah's statement is going to try to differentiate between the food that's purchased with Meiser Sheni money and then also the remains of the mincha offering, and then try to figure it out that way. So Rabbi Mana is going to come rescue us and help us to resolve this, and then we'll finish up the halacha. The Gemara says, Rabbi Mana says, I once went to Caesarea and I heard Rabbi Hiskiah sitting and teaching, and he began with a Mishnah and says, if one betrothed a woman with his portion of a sacrificial offering, whether it is Kodesh Kodeshim or Kodeshim Kalim, she is not betrothed. Why? Because Rabbi Hiskiah is saying that sacrificial food has been consecrated and it's the property of the divine. Rabbi Lazar says in this Gemara that the ruling is agreed upon by everyone. In other words, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would agree, and although Rabbi Yehuda rules that regarding the Meiser Sheni, that is the property of the owner, what is done, and that basically that can affect betrothal. That's his point. And Rabbi Yochanan says that the ruling is a matter of Tanaic dispute. According to Rabbi Meir, sacrificial food like Meiser Sheni is a property of the divine and cannot affect betrothal. Rabbi Yehuda says, like Meiser Sheni, it's the property of the owner and it can affect it. So you can acquire a wife, according to Rabbi Yehuda, with the Meiser Sheni money. And Rabbi Meir continues and says, I said to Rabbi Hiskiah, from whom did my teacher hear this thing? And where did you, hear about this dispute between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yochanan? And the Gemara says to me, he said to me from Rabbi Yirmiyah, and I said, it is well. In other words, this resolves this difficulty that Rabbi Yosei poses, and Rabbi Mana is going to explain it. Rabbi Mana explains and says, Rabbi Yirmiyah, because he learned this teaching from Rabbi Elazar, that the Mishnah's ruling regarding a sacrificial offering is agreed upon by everyone. That is why he said that the validity of tithes separated from Meiser Sheni money is in dispute. And the tithes separated from the remains of the mincha offering is not in dispute. So he follows the view of Rabbi Lazar, who says that Rabbi Yehuda distinguishes between the Meiser Sheni and the sacrificial foods, and they would treat the sacrificial food as property of the owner. The Meiser Sheni is property of the owner, and treat the sacrificial food as property of the divine. So Rabbi Yosei, says this Gemara, on the other hand, says who did not learn Rabbi Lazar's teaching, but followed the view of Rabbi Yochanan, was in doubt as to the meaning of Rabbi Yirmiyah's statement. And the Gemara says that Rabbi and this is why he said, this is talking about Rabbi Yehuda himself, drawing a distinction between Meiser Sheni and sacrificial offerings. And the Gemara says that this is why he said, which dispute does Rabbi Yerushalmi refer to? And according to Rabbi Beur, who's going to consider Meiser Sheni as property of the divine, the law of Meiser Sheni is identical to the law of the remains of the mincha offering. And that's to say that it's going to be the property of the divine. So the Gemara says that the one who tithes either one of them has accomplished nothing. And in either case, the produce is not his own. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who considers the Meiser Sheni of the mincha offering to be your property, according to that, where a person is going to tithe that, what he's done, he's done. In other words, that tithe is going to be valid. And the way this gets resolved is going to be like this. So Rabbi Yosef is basically going to be not following Rabbi Lazar's teaching and holding that Rabbi Yehuda makes no such distinction as per the view of Rabbi Yochanan, and his challenge to Rabbi Yerushalmi is based on that position. In other words, in the end of this, the Gemara is recording a dispute whether between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir as to who owns the sacrificial food. This comes up again in Bavli, Kiddushin 52b, and Rabbi Yehuda is disputing about the Meiser Sheni on who owns it. And ultimately, the Rambam in Meiser 1319 is going to validate both tithes separated from the remains of the mincha offering and those separated from food purchased with the Meiser Sheni money. But as you can see here, the Gemara is going to exclude one of those. So that's going to be a question on to why that's going to be like that, and that's above my pay grade. So the Gemara continues, so the Mishnah continues, says, regarding fragrant oil acquired from the Am Haaretz, Bet Shammai rules it subject to Demai and those tithes, and Bet Hillel exempts it from the tithes. And then we'll finish this up, and it'll be real quick. So the Gemara identifies the oil of Bet Hillel's exemption, and they said it was taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda said Bet Hillel ruled no fragrant oils exempt from spice, but spice oil alone. And this is going to basically, be where oil is going to be exempt because it's mixed in with spices, and they're not going to be subject to tithing. And the Demai decree was not stated regarding these kinds of mixtures. That's going to be the idea. So only spiced oil, and that's going to be, again, oil mixed with spices. That's going to be what we're talking about. We're not talking about perfume. We're talking about food oil that's mixed with spices. And the Gemara finishes and says the Baraisa cites a type of spiced oil that was used and that is subject to the Demai according to Bet Hillel. And they said others say in the name of Rabbi Nassan that Bet Hillel ruled rose oil because it's known as Veronin, and that's subject to Demai tithes. So why would this rose oil be the one exemption? That, by the way, comes up in Meiser Sheni because it could be used as either a fragrant oil or as a food oil. And so we see that some varieties of roses in Maseket Shvius, some can be used for food, and some can be used only for anointing or for fragrance, and so that will be whether it has sanctity or not. And so if it's going to be used as a food oil, it could, it's going to be regarded as a mixture, and it's going to be like spiced oil. But if it's only going to be used as, this rose oil is only going to be used as perfume, then it's going to just, be regarded as like perfume. Anyway, I get the mitzvah of watching and teaching my son Torah, and that is the most important thing. Have a great day.